So where do our laws come from? I know I just touched on our criminal laws are created by our legislators. We'll speak in more depth about that in this topic. But you need to know where the laws originated from. So we are going to cover the sources of law in the American judicial system. So where do they come from? In these five, actually there's a sixth one. I'm going to tell you about it right here, but we are not going to be involved with it. Where do they come from? The common law, some area called the common law. We'll explain these in detail. Statutory law, constitutional law, administrative rules, and ordinances. I alluded to the fact there's a number six. The number six is executive laws. You may have heard that in the time that we're in, the governor of New York making executive laws, the president of the United States making executive laws. Certainly, these leaders can do so. They have no bearing on what we're talking about, so I don't want to confuse you anymore. But I want to talk about these areas because this is where we will find some of our criminal laws. So let's start with the common law. Common law, where does it come from? What is it? It is old. I'll put it out there. It is old judge-made law, developed back in England in the 11th century. I was going to go with the 1600s, 11th century. And this was a system that they used throughout England. And it's worked out by, well, I don't know if they actually called them judges back then, jurists, that these are folks that would get together to sort out people's issues. Now we're talking about a time frame when we're dealing with, land. Now, when I say property, I mean land. Issues involving, their trades that they were involved in, whether it was like farming or making certain pottery, or it was very simplified back then, obviously. It was based on what that society was at the time, or their customs at the time, that made these laws. And these laws still exist today. They develop over time. And the judges would decide these cases after they've considered other cases as well. So let's talk about the development here. So we have these old cases, and this is what American colonial laws have developed on. It is what we've developed. We still call it the common law. It still exists today in various areas. The book talks about common law crimes, and I'll distinguish the criminal law developed out of the common law, but it's no longer a foundation of where we find our criminal law. You wouldn't be charged with a criminal law that stems from the common law, but as we work through these specific crimes like homicide and assault and rape and so forth, I will distinguish as to how they developed from the common law into what they are now. So you have to know that this common law is out here. Common law is really used in contracts and real estate and so forth. But nonetheless, this concept that I'm just about to talk about applies everywhere. And it is what judges do when they are deciding cases. As cases evolve over time, they look at what they've done in the past. They do a look back. Kind of keeps laws consistent. If we're dealing with a certain kind of case, well, what did we do in that case before? Let's do the same thing. Or maybe if it's not the same thing, maybe we develop it a little bit more. But develop consistency, continuity in the law. Judges look back to what previous decisions have been made, and those are called precedent. And precedent, or sometimes called authority, you might hear that term. It's a rule that has been established by a court in a prior case that can be referred to for guidance in deciding later cases. Why is it important? I just kind of alluded to it. Consistency, continuity. Because if it can change on a dime or a moment's notice or with the next case then you really don't know what the quote-unquote law is. But can it ever change? Sure, it can change. Like I said, this is developed from the 11th century. Certainly times have changed. What may have been a good ruling back then, or even 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we see this with the Supreme Court all the time. What might change due to, social issues and what the judge's values are, or just society as a whole. So yes, it can change, but the rule is that judges will generally expect and adhere to what's called precedent, which our Latin term is, you'll see it up there, stare decisis. It means let the decision stand. But let's talk about when courts would not go and look to precedent. Maybe the circumstances are different in a particular case. Maybe, like I said, the social values of society have changed. The judges on the courts can change. We see that. It's very in the media relative to our Supreme Court. We now, with a more conservative president, who got to choose 2 Supreme Court justices, we now have a more conservative leaning court, meaning decisions are going to be affected by that as they come forward. There is an example in the book that I want to refer to in using this concept of precedent, which is what the courts prefer to do. Jeffrey is a defense attorney for Conrad, who is on trial for first-degree murder. The murder prosecution is taking place in the state of New Mexico. Jeffrey finds case precedent from the New York Court of Appeals that's dated 1999 that indicates that Conrad should have been prosecuted for voluntary manslaughter, not first-degree murder. I'm going to stop there for a moment before I read the rest of the facts. So just to kind of recap, Jeffrey finds this case from New York, and they are in New Mexico, but it's very favorable to Conrad. Now Brandon, who's the prosecutor, finds a case from New Mexico Supreme Court, which is the highest court in New Mexico, and New York Court of Appeals, by the way, it's the highest court in New York. We'll talk about the court system. And that case is dated 2008. That indicates that first-degree murder prosecution is appropriate. Now the question is, what will a court do with that precedent information? What might you think the court would do? Well, since Brandon, who's the prosecutor, has a precedent case from the state of New Mexico, which is the place where this case is being prosecuted, and it's 2008, so it's newer, the court is more likely to go in line with that precedent versus the one from New York, which is a different state, and it's a little older. So that's how they apply precedent. But they certainly can change if they need to change and make different rulings. Most of the time, those decisions come from high courts like a Supreme Court or a higher court in the state. And we'll talk about the states, and we'll circle back. We'll talk about the state court system, and we'll circle back to the discussion on precedent. So where do you find common law? Before we find the common law, which are in books and statutes, these are the other options that the court has that they can do. They can, like I said, apply precedent, accept or follow. They can modify it, but they have to provide a different reason as to why they're modifying it or changing it. They can distinguish. They can say this case has nothing to do with precedent, so it doesn't apply. Or they can just declare that that's really old and that's not what we're doing here. It's not proper with the times. It could be an issue involving technology, which didn't exist, at least social media didn't exist 20, 30 years ago. The internet was just getting underway in the late 80s, early 90s. So a number of things could result in the court overruling. So where does the common law come from? Where do you find it? It's in volumes of texts that have been decisions have been written over the centuries, and it really used to be laborious to go and find it in a book. It comes with a citation, we call it the address, where you can find it. But if you have that address, you can just type it into the internet, and boom, there it is for you. Statutory law. What is statutory law? Where does it come from? How does it differ from common law? Well, let's start with where does it come from? I already indicated that from the last lecture. Our legislators, city, state, and federal legislators, so our elected bodies of politicians, they create the laws. And they usually are dealing with things that affect society as a whole. And they could put laws into place based on what they could anticipate are problems, or most of the time they put laws in kind of after the fact. Oh, we need to change that, or we need to do this, we need to look at this. So they can kind of anticipate problems or deal with one that may have already come up, and it won't happen again in the future. How does it differ from common law? Well, sometimes these are based on common law, and criminal law, which is now all statutory, is based on the old common law. And we'll talk about details when we talk about specific laws. So the common law, which has been created over time by jurists, do not have any bearing anymore in the society we live in relative to criminal laws, because we have all statutory laws that guide us. And each state, as I said, has their own body of criminal laws. So that's what we're going to be dealing with mostly. But do we ever have any problems with statutory laws? Sure, we can. And actually, I don't want to jump the gun there. Let's talk about this law right here. Statutory law. They make laws. There it is. Nice and easy. You can look it up in the book. Oh, look, it's illegal to distribute a violent video game to minors. Do you see any problem with this law? This was a real law, by the way, that was passed in the state of California. And it had problems. Can you see what the problems might be? It is illegal to distribute a violent video game to minors. If you own let's say a video store, how do you follow this rule? What might be some questions you have? How about what's considered violent? We can all make assumptions. What I think is violent, you might not think is violent. Who's a minor? What kind of particular age category are we talking about here? You might already be, anyone who's under the age of 18. Well, that's not always the case, depending on what state you're in or which law you're referring to, because sometimes the minor caps off at 15, sometimes at 16, sometimes at 17, sometimes at 21. So it depends on what we're talking about. So we don't know who the minor is in here. And what's distribution anyway? Do not distribute. What does that mean? Sell, lease, rent, give away? So there was, obviously, you could see problems with this particular statutory law. And what happens is a court has to come in and interpret it. Statutory is called statutory construction, to see what it really means. And if it can't be deciphered, if a reasonable person cannot decipher this, most of the time the court will toss it out as unconstitutional, as vague or overbroad. One of those two terms. It's rare that happens, but it does happen. So those decisions that courts makes becomes the law. So it's kind of like the common law in that sense. You're still going to have courts that are going to have to come in and interpret these things. Where else do our laws come from? Constitutional law. And if I ask you, where does it come from? Are you saying the U.S. Constitution? Well, that's one area. But each state and city has some form of a constitution. So you could find our U.S. Constitution is the Constitution. New York State has a Constitution. City of Plattsburgh has a Constitution. And basically it provides a plan for government, how they're going to be established and how they're going to be organized. It also outlines everybody's duties and responsibilities and powers of government for the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches. And it also guarantees our basic rights as the individuals who live under the federal constitution, under the state constitution, under the city charters. So I want to ask, who does it protect? Who does the Constitution protect? Everyone who is on U.S. soil, and I'm referring to the federal Constitution. If you're in New York, everyone who's in the state of New York. If you're in the city of Plattsburgh, the city charters apply to everybody who's in the city of Plattsburgh. Doesn't mean you have to reside here. Doesn't have to be. You have to be a citizen. If we're talking about the federal government, if you're here, if somebody's here illegally from another country on U.S. soil, they are afforded the protections under our U.S. Constitution. And who's it protecting us from? Action by the government, not each other. I can't, violate your right to free speech. We are individuals, but the state of New York can't, or the federal government can't pass laws that violate our right to free speech, or our right to bear arms, or our right to practice religion. So it's the government's action that is protecting us from. The U.S. Constitution is our supreme law of the land. So if there's any law or any state or city constitution, charter, that conflicts with it, it's unenforceable. Now you might be thinking, whoa, laws passed all the time that are unconstitutional. Yep, that's how the states happen. Let's try and pass a law. And if there's a problem with it, the courts can fight it out. We'll see. This is going on a lot in the South due to our new layout of the United States Supreme Court. A lot of the southern states are passing laws regarding tightening laws regarding abortion, and there are a lot of lawsuits making their ways up into the federal court in hopes to get to the United States Supreme Court to make yet another ruling on the abortion laws. So certainly the states try, and it's up to the courts to sort out. I'm not going to go into a Constitution lesson here. I just want to point out, because it's going to be important as we might touch on these a little later, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, and if you took criminal procedure, like I said, it's not going to be a big part of this class, but if you took criminal procedure, there's like 7 of the amendments, 6 of the amendments that have even like 4 or 5 components to them that relate to criminal procedure. So that's an important area you should know. Administrative rules and ordinances. Where do they come from? Our administrative agencies. What's an administrative agency? The Environmental Protection Agency, the Food and Drug Administration, the Department of Motor Vehicles. These are all the Department of Public Health, the Clinton County Health Department. It's a local administrative agencies. These are all agencies that have their own rules and regulations. They are created by their agencies themselves. You might be wondering why that's important to criminal law. It won't be something we will delve into, but I'd like to point it out nonetheless as we go along, where we can find certain laws. Like, for instance, we can find criminal laws under the public health law, which is governed by the health department, the New York State Health Department, in that you can't grow cannabis. That's illegal. You're going to be charged with a crime, but it's not under the New York State Penal Code, which is what this class is going to be focusing on. We're going to be looking at the model penal code, but we're going to be focused on street type crimes, as they are kind of called, homicide and rape and assault and theft, things of that nature, street crimes, like I said. But the Environmental Protection Agency has criminal laws when you commit crimes against the environment, whether it's illegal dumping into a lake or an ocean. And the Food, Drug and Food Administration is focused on the food that we eat being something that isn't going to kill us, right? So these folks monitor and act accordingly and charge where they have to try to charge criminally, and to make sure that their administrative rules are being followed. They have a little different proceeding in that if they want to fine somebody, and it's usually big fines in those arenas, they have their own little trial practice, but if it doesn't pan out favorably, there's always the avenue of going to court. And I'm going to just leave it at that, because we're not really going to be talking about the administrative process, but you need to know there are some criminal laws that stem from our administrative agencies. And, the purpose is to protect health, safety, and welfare of society. And so are ordinances, which are also called things like infractions or violations. And you find those in cities mostly, related to health, again, and safety and welfare, with the no littering, noise violations. Those things will fall under the helms of whoever who's deemed the city prosecutor. Sometimes a state prosecutor will come in if it's serious enough, but most of the time they're just enforced by a local code ordinance individual in the city. But you need to know they're there, because there are crimes and they do get charged, and sometimes they find their way into the criminal court system. So that sums up sources of law and this week's lecture. It's very slow going this week. I want to make sure people get into the class or registered in the class and get caught up. I like to leave week one a little on the down low, but I anticipate things will start picking up next week when we jump into the American judicial system and the court system and constitutional protections.